Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anuj Patel. I'm a director of product at PatientsLikeMe. I'm here to talk to you today about TrialMark, which is an initiative that we did in tandem with industry partners AstraZeneca and Takeda to develop a standardized measurement of patient experience in clinical trials. Today, I want to talk to you about TrialMark and the development of that measure, some of the key findings we had in developing this initiative, and also sort of laying out a roadmap or a suggested roadmap for some next steps moving forward. Before doing so, I want to sort of revisit the title of this part of the session, which focuses on continuous improvement. I feel like continuous improvement is sort of underpinned by the collection of large quantities of data. Some of the best sort of consumer-facing products and services that we trust and respect really follow this principle, and their organizations are centered around the collection of data from their customers. We don't necessarily do this as much in the clinical trial space, and I think part of the reason is twofold. One, the clinical trial is viewed as a science experiment that leads to a commercial product, which is then sort of, we study and collect information directly from the consumer or patients on. But the science experiment, the trial itself, is really a hurdle that one must overcome to commercialization. I think a second aspect is that, collecting patient experience is a bit subjective, right? And I've gotten this feedback quite a bit when I sort of pose this question. There are too many different trials. There are too many different trial types. It's really hard to understand what really matters to patients overall in the clinical trial space. I, in a humble sort of attempt to inspire this group, I would suggest that that's false, and perhaps no different than what we used to think about temperature being a subjective measurement, which obviously is not the case. With TrialMark, what we tried to do was create sort of a measurement platform to improve patient experience in clinical trials. We thought initially going into this that it was simply going to be a measure, a sort of survey of patient experience. That actually, again, was a key finding that we realized very quickly on that was false. To really have this become a mainstay in the clinical trial space, it needed a few things. It needed sort of cross-industry adoption. It needed strong leadership from the clinical trial sponsors to say, yes, this is something we're going to work with you to develop and include into clinical trials. The measure itself wasn't really, it needed to be developed with the same level of rigor as a clinical trial itself. So it couldn't just be a simple consumer research study, interviewing a few patients and sort of assembling together a questionnaire. It needed to have the same sort of rigor that one would use with the trial. And then the second main thing that we learned was that you needed an entire infrastructure, ecosystem around it. You needed to work with the teams that were actually deploying these types of instruments or deploying measurements into clinical trials to figure out what is the best way to develop a mechanism by which you can include this into the trial, deploy it into a trial, collect the data, and centralize or aggregate it to make sort of one contextualized database for analysis. And I think that, again, the idea of measurement is paramount in this space. If we want to improve the trial experience for patients, we first have to measure the trial experience for patients. So, again, this has been, a process that we've started upon almost 18 months ago. The measurement itself, started off by first interviewing patients. We're lucky on PatientsLikeMe to obviously have access to patients in a variety of different therapeutic areas. So that formed the basis of our sort of concept elicitation. From there, we identified over 41 different domains of patient experience. These ranged from traits like altruism to sort of burden of participation. Within each one of those domains, we were able to identify sort of items or specific questions that we want to ask. At one point, we had over 160 different questions, which obviously is far too burdensome of a measure to introduce into a trial. So then we sort of had to start whittling it down. So we went through stages of cognitive debriefing to understand, okay, what are the most salient questions that we wanted to introduce into the trial. That led to what we now have is our sort of beta measure, which is basically 3 modules given to patients upon their first visit to a trial site at a defined midpoint of a trial and upon their last visit to the trial site. Each module is about 12 to 20 questions. It takes about 4 to 5 minutes to complete. It's on a 6-point Likert scale. It's pretty, standardized and formatted from that standpoint. AstraZeneca has been, has taken the initiative to sort of adopt this into one of their clinical trials as sort of our first go. We've hopefully identified a few more trials to start deploying this in with. The second step that we're doing is really trying to form that framework or that infrastructure I described earlier, which is how do we find the right set of deployment partners to include this in a relatively easy electronic fashion so that if a clinical trial does want to use a measure, they can do so, and there's a sort of conduit or method of collection of that data from that trial. And then finally, you want to create sort of a de-identified, contextualized database, something that can be analyzed with the idea of producing sort of insights that hopefully inform better clinical trial design moving forward. What do I mean by that? I mean, there's hard metrics that we can collect from a clinical trial, things like retention or, recruitment cost or the length of time it takes to recruit. But, for all the patient-centric initiatives introduced, using a standardized measurement allows something that's cross-comparable. It allows hopefully a future state over the next 12 to 18 months where we can introduce or begin to perform the analysis that says, what types of initiatives lead to better retention, or what types of design in your materials lead to a shorter recruitment time frame. That's the idea of standardization. It's, again, a practice that's used in the consumer-facing industry, and it's one that I would humbly suggest that we try to introduce for the clinical trial space. Thank you.
Well done, Anuj. Did you see that? His last word, and it began to blink. It was perfectly timed. Well done. Questions? Andrea.
Could you just talk, hi, this is
And
Andrea Ferris from Longevity
please.
Foundation. Could you talk a little bit about how you developed the questions that you asked?
Yeah, so we had a team at PLM. So once we had identified those sort of domains, we... Oh, sorry, through patient and expert interviews, yeah. And again, we did that across, I think it was 80 different therapeutic areas.
Okay. Next question. Robert.
Robert McBurney, Accelerate Cure Project for MS. Is there a research opportunity, or have you done it already, to look at the changes in sensitivity of your measure as you reduce down the number of elements in the measure?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a research opportunity for sure. If you notice the process where we say the validation process, that's something we did measure, but not in a publishable format, something that was, I guess, more internal, that we did measure sort of the sensitivity. For sure, you're gonna have less sort of nuance, I guess, as you reduce and create a more concise instrument, but that doesn't remove the power or the value of that instrument as a whole. For instance, Net Promoter Score, which is a concept introduced in the consumer space, is a very powerful cross-industry measure, and that's one question. So that's sort of, for sure there's a trade-off, and for sure there's a future research opportunity.
I just wonder if it's a generalizable gap in this area, and not just in your particular, but
right.
in across all of these situations where measures are used, and we don't quite know, as we've come to the final measure, what the sensitivity is relative to maybe the starting point measures.
Excellent point. And so is it Rebecca? Nope. Eva. Thank you, Eva. Sorry. Eva, and then Ron, you had a question as well? Thank you. Eva, please introduce yourself for the transcriber.
Hi, I'm Eva Katz from Janssen. I had a question if you also look at perceived efficacy and how that might impact with the measure.
I'm sorry, perceived
Efficacy from the patient perspective, and how that might impact this measure. So if they perceive the treatment working versus not, given their participation within a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. So that would probably, as we begin to adopt or introduce this into clinical trials, that could be something where we could, that would definitely form the basis of something to study or research further.
All right. Ron.
Ron Bartek, Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance. So Anuj, what's the plan going forward in terms of possibly sharing this tool with other communities and other sponsors?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great point. So we're actually, this instrument or the measure itself will be eventually a free-to-use measure, right? So the idea is that any trial sponsor can adopt this with the only idea that the data be shared, the de-identified survey output be shared to be centralized and analyzed. Again, that's a main sort of component moving forward. I think the other main component is trying to find the right set of deployment partners or relationships to, again, further advance or ensure the frictionless inclusion into clinical trials moving forward.
All right. Any final question? Yes, over here. Frank.
Hi, Fran Solo from International.
I'm not sure it turned on. Did it turn on?
This one. Okay.
Okay, could you say it again, please?
Fran Sowell from PharMerit International. Thank you for your presentation. Can you say a little bit more about the implementation of this survey? I'm not understanding clearly how you actually use it in the context of the trials.
Yeah.
At what point in the process?
Yeah, so it's, again, so there's no sort of open-ended, open response. So we've designed it in a way to not really mess with or in any way sort of cause any modifications to the trial protocol itself. This is basically an instrument that if a trial decides to use this measure, they would use whatever deployment specification they have for existing things like informed consent or any other PRO instruments they might have for that particular trial and include this measure into that workflow. So right now it's a sort of paper-based medium. Moving forward, we would want to work with, again, a deployment vendor or a company that has electronic capabilities to provide or implement this into a trial, provide it to patients, and then have that data return to give us back that sort of de-identified survey output.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Oh, was there one more quick question in the back? Yeah, Hildy? And if you could identify yourself for the transcriber, please.
Yeah, so Hildy Dillon, Cancer Support Community. This is exciting. When the patients are completing this, is it actually in the clinic, and do you provide iPads or some type of tablet for them to import the information, or is that different at every study site? How do you see that actually happening?
Yeah, so that's another sort of key finding, that every trial is different, right? Every trial has different budgets, different number of trial sites. So trying to create sort of like we want standardization. It's funny because we want standardization in the actual measurement, but sort of an open source approach for how it's implemented, because again, there's going to be so much nuance in how that should be done. So certain vendors we want to work with for sure have sort of like a tablet-based approach where you can use that, but that might not work for certain trial sites where, I don't know, there either isn't internet access or there isn't the budget to support that. In which case you have to either use a paper-based medium and have a protocol which we've developed to support that, or have an online approach where if there's a computer terminal at the trial site, the patient sits in front of the computer and completes it. In any case, going back to your original question, the goal is for the patient to complete that this instrument at the trial site.
All right. Can we thank Anuj for really a great presentation and all your good questions?